We had planned on going to a massive amusement park just outside of town. A fun little trip to celebrate Tim and Jasmine's recent engagement. But the old gas station attendant's words, his cryptic warning, were oddly enticing, and we decided to instead explore the allegedly mystical place. The mirage-like forest of Oliniver. Beware the ephemeral forest of Oliniver. From the black boughs of its titan trees peer down imps and incubi of madness, while demonian insects, invisible to the eyes of mortal men, cling to its glass-armored boles. The frost-draped ruins and relics of an ancient and unremembered kingdom, to which it owes its name, can be found in crumbled and half-sunken states throughout, though the portals and recesses that remain may harbor more than shadow and dust. Tread not upon the time-resistant flagstones. Enter not the lightless halls, with their stagnant air of countless cycles. Rest not beneath teetering porticos. Stand not upon the perilously slanting balconies. There is more than the danger of ruin amidst the aged and derelict structures. More than a weird cold haunts that fleeting region, which only appears but briefly every few centuries to the north of town. Northeast of this very gas station. For what seemed like miles in every direction, there was only the weird crystalline coating over everything. Not a single blade of grass had been spared at the blasting of the oddly bluish glaze. No petal remained unburdened by the semi-transparent and frost-like calcification. The ground, where it was traversable, was slick, and we had to carefully mount certain structures or briefly slide down others. The air even seemed thick with crystals. The atmosphere, somehow both humidly stuffy and cold, glittered softly in the ever-present light. There was no sun or moon that we could have seen above the glazed canopy of trees, and yet there was light. There weren't any of the unusual smells that you would normally find in the woods or forest. There was only the paradoxically muggy and chilled air. Finally, after what had seemed like hours of careful walking, climbing, and mantling, we came upon a courtyard, or what would have been a courtyard in some former pre-ruined time. But now it was glazed over, lustrous but in an eerie, almost a dismal way. There was a fairly large stone gazebo in the center, and while I'm sure that it had probably looked nice, perhaps even elegant in some earlier state, in that moment it looked crudely structured, covered as it was with sheets of crystal glaze. Stalactites of varying lengths hung at random from the edges of its dome ceiling, and a high-backed chair proportioned for a figure much larger than that of a human sat within its seat empty. The stonework of both the gazebo and the flagstones of the courtyard were impressive, had been laid with immaculate care, and yet intermittently throughout, clusters of crystals had forcibly peeked through like invasive weeds. It was a depressing scene, to see such antique beauty so totally overtaken by the strange growth. Tim and Jasmine had been rendered speechless by the darkly fantastical forest sometime earlier in our unforeseen trek. But now, seeing the first sign of civilization, albeit ancient, they both spoke up. Tim wondered aloud at the origin of the structure, while Jasmine directly asked me if I recognized the historical handiwork. I had casually studied a few ancient civilizations but didn't recognize the architecture, couldn't place it within any specific culture. The columns supporting the gazebo's hexagonal roof were thick, and broadly petaled vines had been sculpted around them, giving the appearance of the pillars being naturally overgrown. The crystal glaze had simply been an unforeseen step further in this design. The structure's builders had been master craftsmen, artisans, and it pained me to see their work so horribly defaced. Despite the craftsmanship and the decor of the gazebo, the chair, which was fairly simple, plain in its construction and design, you would have thought it had been placed there by someone, if it weren't for the fact that it was clearly cemented to the gazebo's floor, and not by the glaze either, which had somehow been kept from the gazebo's interior. The chair was a fundamental fixture of the overall structure. Even though we had taken great pains to avoid direct or at least sustained contact with anything in the forest, Tim had entered the gazebo and sat down in the chair. For a moment, no one said anything, and then Tim, after exhaling, said that he felt fine and that the chair was, despite its appearance, fairly comfortable. We had been walking for a while, so I assumed the comfort he found was owed more to basic physical relief than the rigid seat itself. We waited around for a while, unsure of what to do, while outside the courtyard the ostensibly lifeless forest carried on a funereal ambience of soft winds and trembling crystals. Eventually, Tim got up and motioned for Jasmine to have a seat, and she did so eagerly, despite her earlier aversion to coming anywhere near the structure. I leaned up against the gazebo's railing, careful to not let my bare arms come into contact with its glazed shell. Jasmine settled into the chair as best as she could and tossed her head back. When her eyes met the ceiling, she went rigid, and her mouth dropped open. My gaze followed hers, and Tim presumably did as well, because he softly said, "Oh crap." Hanging from the ceiling of the gazebo, extending waist down from the stonework, was some kind of knight, inhumanly broad-shouldered, armored from head to waist in black iron. And in his gloved hands, frozen mid-draw, was a massive bow aimed directly at the seat, at Jasmine. The figure's head was covered by a helmet, but through the faceplate, its eyes could be seen, spectrally radiant with a crimson luster. Viewed from an angle, I could see the light of eyes through the thin slit in the faceplate, but from Jasmine's position, she saw them full on, and was thus transfixed by them. Tim and I weren't made aware that she had been trying to move until we saw her temple become damp with sweat, despite the considerable chill that pervaded the courtyard. Tim rushed over, shouting Jasmine's name, and I scrambled to find something, a dislodged stone or box or some other weighty object, for a reason my mind didn't immediately make me aware of, until I saw Tim fail to remove Jasmine from the seat. And then, putting two and two together, my eyes flashed to the bow, to the deadly stone arrow knocked therein, and to the drawstring that was threateningly taut. I knew then that the arrow would be loosed, that its baseball-sized head would find a target at the top of Jasmine's skull. I then took in the full scene. The debris beneath the chair, which I had initially regarded as mere dust, fallen from the ceiling through the countless cycles. By now, with my mind finally comprehending, I realized that the dust had most likely come from someone, that it was probably the time-molded remains of the chair's previous occupant. Things happened very fast after that. Tim, who had been my best friend for years, proved himself to be not just a great friend, but a great fiancé as well. He unshouldered his pack and handed it to me, telling me as he did so that I would need the food and water to make it back, that I would make it back, and that he was thankful for all the time we had spent together over the years. And then before I could argue, he stepped in front of the ceiling-hung archer and looked directly into its smoldering eyes. And just as Jasmine had been, he was immediately frozen in place by the spectral and Medusian gaze of the archer. What I hadn't expected was for Jasmine to be released from the spell. I don't think Tim had either. I think he had planned on dying with Jasmine, because it was plainly obvious that the power of the massive bow would send its stone arrow clear through him. The intent behind his self-sacrifice had been to somewhat lessen Jasmine's own terror, by allowing her to at least die with someone else, with the one that she loved. But now, with her being released, Tim would die alone. Once freed, Jasmine quickly leapt up from the seat, her eyes closed. She would have run right into the rim of the gazebo in her panicked flight, if I hadn't steered her clear of it at the last moment. Cradling her, I tried to think of something to say, of any words I could offer that would ease her mounting grief and panic. But I couldn't think of anything, and instead led her away from the gazebo and her immobilized fiancé. just when I had sat her down on the edge of a nearby crumbling fountain, in the middle of which was a sculpture of a massive, unnameable spider-like creature. I heard a sound, soft though profound in its dire suggestion. Turning around, my eyes immediately went to the archer, and my heart plummeted into my stomach at what I saw. The arrow had been loosed from the great bow, and it was traveling downward at an impossibly slow speed toward Tim's upraised head. And tears swelled in my eyes at realizing that the stone arrow would strike at the very center of his forehead. I ran over to him knowing that there was nothing I could do but wanting to try anyway, and upon drawing nearer I saw the terror mounting in his eyes, straining his frozen face. He was still sentient, still aware, and the sight of that fearsome arrow, suspended by some dark magic in the air before him, must have been absolutely terrifying. I was literally able to track the arrow's flight. It was moving so slowly, perhaps a fourth of an inch every few seconds. Against my nerves, I reached out and grabbed the arrow shaft, and while there was no pain or discomfort from the contact, the sensation was nonetheless unsettling. Feeling my hand being guided along by the gravity-defying arrow. Assuming that there would be no harm in trying, I gripped the shaft tightly and tried to stop its progress, but it continued on despite my efforts. Next, I tried to alter its path, to shove it in one direction, and when that failed to produce results, pull it the other way. But I was either too weak or the arrow's flight path was simply unalterable. It had maybe been predestined to strike true. Finally accepting the futility of my efforts, I let go of the arrow and resumed my previous search for something to intercept the arrow with, while ignoring the thoughts in my head that arose in regards to the arrow's preternaturally persistent momentum and kinetic energy, which, the disheartening voices said, would surely allow it to push or even pass through anything I put before it. I found a single object, a flagstone that had been dislodged in some geologic event probably centuries before our arrival. It was heavy, surprisingly so, and I had to awkwardly waddle with it against my stomach, costing myself valuable time. Jasmine looked on, with despair and confusion in her eyes, not yet understanding what I had intended to do. When I reached him, I hoisted the stone above me while crouching in front of him. The weight of it, which had to have at least been 50 or 60 pounds, quickly became more than a little burdensome by the awkward position in which I had to hold it. But the arrow was close, 2 or 3 inches away, and I couldn't move. I could only brace myself for the impact, and hope that it could counteract the force of the huge projectile without tottering or dropping the stone. I tried not to think of how much of a morbidly ironic twist of fate it would be if the arrow was embedded in the stone, but sent it falling right into Tim's face. When the arrow struck, I felt my arms immediately overcome by the sheer force of it. It wasn't fast, but it was unfightable. The arrow had simply continued its deadly descent, as if there weren't a stone slab in its way. Since I had been facing away from him when I had raised the stone, I couldn't see Tim's face, and I found myself thankful for that. I knew that I wouldn't be able to bear the sight of his eyes, filled with an unrelatable terror at seeing his imminent death, now promising to be even grislier. And to have your face slowly crushed by a slab of concrete, your head gradually pushed back until your neck snapped. Weirdly, terribly, I couldn't simply drop the stone. I tried to release it, hoping that the arrow now was embedded in its surface, and I could let gravity take them both, save Tim's life, and end this particular aspect of the nightmare. But when I released the slab, it simply moved along with the arrow. It was carried along with the same unstoppable momentum and glacial slowness. I stepped back to judge the angling slab. Desperately, I tried to move him, hoping against hope that Jasmine's rigid immovability had been tied more so to the chair than her person. But despite my greatest efforts, Tim wouldn't budge. He'd be firmly planted where he stood, and I couldn't move his body an inch in any direction. I heard Jasmine let out a low, anguished moan behind me, and turning around I saw her staring with her eyes, pouring out tears. She had been watching my efforts the whole time and had come to accept the inevitability of her fiancé's death. I couldn't think of anything else to do. Couldn't come up with a new plan or even some last-ditch effort. Going back to Tim, I wrapped my arms around him and gave him the tightest hug that I could, and I thanked him for having been such a great friend to me. I watched as new tears gathered in his eyes, and then released them. The stone and its arrow propellant were only 2 inches away from his face now. Not wanting Jasmine to witness Tim's assuredly violent and woefully unpreventable death, I helped her up and led her away from the courtyard. As we walked on and deeper into the crystalline forest, I found myself growing increasingly unsettled by the quietness of it all. I thought to myself that I would have probably preferred to hear some evidence of Tim's demise, one final exclamation of life from him, rather than the ceaselessly dismal ambience of the forest. Jasmine remained mostly silent, the only sound she made being an occasional whimper or sigh when a new obstacle interrupted or diverted our progress. After 20 minutes or so, we came to the edge of the forest where the vegetation wasn't so thickly covered in the translucent wax, and where the regular, untouched, natural world was visibly beyond the misty horizon. We were both tired, and I knew that Jasmine, having witnessed her fiancé's final moments and had been forced to abandon him, needed rest as soon as possible. I told her to take my arm and close her eyes, and mustering up all my might, pushed into the densely accumulated mist. Just as I had done before, I focused on ignoring the alluring whispers that called for me to let go, and to submit myself woefully and wholly to these specters hidden amidst the mist. It had been easier with the 3 of us. We had talked to each other to take our minds off of the hounding spirits. I saw them flit about, dancing and cavorting before me, attempting to get me to drop my guard. I squeezed Jasmine's hand a little tighter, but not enough to where the sensation would be cause for alarm. I just wanted to reassure that everything was all right, and reassure myself that I wasn't alone with these sorceress phantoms. I knew that if I were to heed their charms that I'd be lost forever, that my spirit or consciousness would be doomed to join them in their eternal trapeze through the mist-laden field. That fact alone was panic-inducing, but not entirely disagreeable. I hadn't anything of real value to go back to in the real world, beyond the mundanity of my regular life. But a life of eternal immateriality and thoughtless gaiety, however strange, wouldn't necessarily be any worse. But I had Jasmine to take care of, and knew that if I were to let go, she would soon follow. So shutting my mind against the ghastly voices and the ghostly figures, I pushed on, and eventually cleared the mist. I took Jasmine home and wasn't sure if I should leave her alone or stay, but she broke our funereal silence and asked me to spend the night. I agreed and settled myself on the living room couch, where Tim and I had spent countless hours playing couch co-op video games. Unsurprisingly, Jasmine went to bed almost immediately after she had taken a shower. Sitting awake on the couch, with its silence and the colossal weight of my failure finally hitting me, I knew that I wouldn't be able to sleep. The hours crawled by, and I eventually decided that I needed to be sure. Needed to know that Tim was dead and that the arrow had flown its lethal course. There was still a few hours until sunrise, and I was confident that I could make it there and back again within that window. After checking on Jasmine, who I found still firmly asleep, I put on my boots and I headed out. It wasn't hard to find the mist-enshrouded field on the edge of town, and despite the fears that had arisen during the trip there, I managed to push through the ghost-haunted fog with ease. I thought that I would have to fight off the voices even harder, but having gone through twice before, I found it much easier to dispel their clawing whispers from my mind. Again, reaching the forest, I headed in the direction of that ancient courtyard, the location of which I had unconsciously memorized, perhaps always knowing that I would need to return to be sure. After maybe 20 minutes of trudging through crystal-encased bushes and crunching over the frosted grass, with that ominous light above and around me, I finally reached the dilapidated courtyard with its crumbling, dry, entirely empty fountain and that death-trap gazebo. I kept my eyes fixed to the flagstones as I approached, not wanting to prematurely see any grisly details. I wanted to take it in all at once, to commit it to my memory so that I could accept and hopefully someday move past the full macabre burden of my failure. But upon reaching the gazebo, I was shocked, though not appalled or horrified. Its interior was empty. There was no sign of Tim or the arrow that I was certain had entered, if not carried away his skull. There was only the dust on the floor, the same dust that I had noticed earlier. Nothing had been added to the pile. Above me, the blackly armored knight stared down smolderingly, its bowstring in an infinitely slow process of recoil, the shielded eyes still alight with some inner animacy. I looked around, leaving the gazebo and peering into the perimeter surrounding the courtyard, but found no evidence of Tim's escape or death. There was only the dismal, ruined courtyard of some bygone era, the glazed leafage, the disconcerting ambience and the ethereal light. I returned to Jasmine's house just before sunrise. She was still asleep and hadn't woken up in my absence. On the way there, I had promised myself that I wouldn't tell her about Tim's mysterious absence from the courtyard, and upon peeking into her bedroom and seeing her peacefully resting face, I knew with full certainty that I couldn't. I couldn't inspire the hope that he was somehow alive. That mystical forest could contain any number of horrors, and just because I hadn't been able to move him didn't mean that something else couldn't have. Something possessing monstrous strength. I sank into the couch, exhausted but unsleeping, and waited for the slow crawl of the sun in the sky. When the soft morning light had filtered into the room, I felt a sudden lethargy fall over me. I remembered the terribly prophetic words of the questionably old gas station clerk, that strange man who had told us about the fleetingly existent forest, and knew that with the sun's arrival came the forest's destruction, or relocation to some other sphere of time and space. And not just that, but Tim's own spatial transition as well. With this grim fact in mind, I was finally able to accept the circumstances, to let go of all hope and, for the moment, rest. But it wasn't until I had started to put together this document that I remembered being aware, yet not consciously taking notice, of the curiously empty fountain. The fountain that had once contained what I had been sure was merely a grotesque sculpture of huge and vaguely arachnid creature,